at her home near Zurich in Switzerland. She'd suffered ill health in recent years, being diagnosed with intestinal cancer in 2016 and having a kidney transplant in 2017. Well, LBC's entertainment editor Charlie Girling says she achieved incredible things throughout her career.
She was one of the first African-American women to ever be on the cover of Rolling Stone, that she's won 12 Grammys, that she received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. I mean, she's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. She sort of superseded her career that she had with Ike, and she became this incredible solo artist and this incredible sort of feminist icon, and somebody that managed to overcome an incredibly difficult marriage.
Well, Tina Turner was best known for her hits, including The Best, Proud Mary and River Deep Mountain High, over a lengthy career. Speaking to her fans on social media on her 80th birthday, Tina embraced getting older.
How did I think I would be at 80? Not like this. How is this? Oh, well, I look great.
Tina Turner, who's died at the age of 83. In other news, the Cabinet Office has been threatened with legal action over trying to release redacted evidence to the COVID inquiry. Chairwoman Baroness Hallett says the entire contents of WhatsApp messages and diaries belonging to Boris Johnson are relevant. Dr. Parth Patel from the Institute of Public Policy Research has told LBC it is vital we get to the bottom of what happened.
Basic functions is to prevent the abuse of power. So to some extent, we have to know how much power was abused. So this question is important. At the same time, Sheila, I am sympathetic to people who are just a bit fed up of this long-running saga.
Boris Johnson is understood to have dismissed a government lawyer acting on his behalf at the inquiry. The former Prime Minister says a decision to pass evidence of possible lockdown breaches at Chequers to police is politically motivated. Police have confirmed a marked van seen on CCTV following an electric bike on Monday was the first on the crash scene but wasn't there at the time it happened. 2 teenagers died before riots broke out. The Governor of the Bank of England has welcomed a fall in the overall rate of inflation to 8.7%, but there are concerns the rise in food prices has only slowed slightly. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 135 points at 76.27. The pound buys $1.23 and €1.14. LBC weather largely dry and settled tonight with lows of 4 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. This is Cross Question.
8 o'clock is the time. Ben Kentish here on LBC, and it is, of course, time for Cross Question. A stellar panel joining me in the studio tonight. We have Paul Scully with us, the Conservative Tech and Digital Economy Minister, also MP for Sutton and Cheam, and recently announced contender to be his party's candidate for the next London mayoral election. Barry Gardiner is here, Labour MP for Brent North and former Shadow International Trade Secretary, as is Harriet Sergeant, a journalist, author and research fellow for the Centre for Policy Studies think tank, and delighted to be joined too by Amelia Womack, former deputy party leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. You know the drill. Your number for your questions, for your thoughts for our panellists, 0345 6060 973. You might have a question tonight about what we've just been talking about. Boris Johnson's allies claiming that Rishi Sunak is behind a witch hunt against the former Prime Minister over Partygate. Perhaps you've got a question about the fact that we learn food prices are rising at their fastest rate for 45 years. You may well want to ask about the finding that Just Stop Oil's slow-marching protest took up 11,000 hours of Metropolitan Police time in just 4 weeks. Or perhaps you've got a question about voter ID after being introduced in polling stations. We now learn the government is going to roll it out to postal voting as well. Perhaps you've got a question about something completely different. 0345 6060 973 is the number. You can text us on 84850 or tweet at LBC. And don't forget, as ever, you can watch Cross Question live right now on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question. Watch on Global Player. This is LBC.
Right, let's get straight to your questions. And Anthony in Staines is going to get us underway tonight. Anthony, good evening.
Indeed. Good evening, Ben and panel. Yes,
Good evening.
Is Sunak's failure to remove Braverman from his cabinet a sign of his strength or his weakness?
Rishi Sunak confirming today the Home Secretary is not going to be sacked or face any sort of disciplinary action for the way that she dealt with that speeding ticket. Is that a sign of his strength, or his weakness? Paul Scully.
I think it's a sign of pragmatism. He sought the advice of his independent advisor on standards, and I think what he's said in his letter, that things could have been done in a better way. But I think you've got to, if you can't just write things off as a black and white, someone's got to stay or someone's got to go. This doesn't happen in any other walk of life. And I think, he said, okay, fine, you should have done, maybe looked at doing it another way, but she hasn't crossed the line. And that's what the independent advisor has that discussion has had. And so I think it's fine. If that's been investigated, that's the conclusion. He should be able to stick the ground. Otherwise, the problem is, if you just look at that, is you can make all manner of vexatious complaints at ministers that you don't like politically. You just don't want to go down that line. That's a really dangerous line to go down, undermining democracy through...
but if it's vexatious, it would be looked into by the independent advisor and dismissed.
Which is what happened. Which is what
should have handled this differently.
But it
wasn't. It wasn't looked into. It was looked into by Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, but he worked with the independent advisor, and the decision that he's taken. Ultimately, it's the Prime Minister that decides on this. He's taken all that advice, and he's come to the view that given her advice that she should have done something, you could have looked at it a different way, but it's nowhere near enough for it to be a sacking offence. I think that should be respected, and I think I'm happy with that.
We spent a disproportionate amount of time since she was appointed talking about various controversies relating to the Home Secretary. Is she becoming a liability for the Prime Minister?
No, I think, as I say, it's always one of these things when people smell blood, they start carrying on going. They were doing the same with Boris, trying to undermine Boris's authority in various areas, and then actually Boris ultimately in Partygate, saw to the end of that because it was right that he stepped down when he did. But what you found was that opposition parties were scratching around trying to find something they could hone in on to undermine standards. And what that ultimately does, it may give them short-term gain, but it ultimately undermines politicians in general. We saw that with the expenses scandal a decade ago. I remember that when I was a local councillor, I was getting it in the neck for all the expenses I was supposed to have when I was just trying to sort out people's bins. It just really does pervade through politics and undermines, I think, democracy. People need to do the right thing. They need to be seen to do the right thing. I think in this, she's had a talking to. You could have done it better. It's not a sacking offence. Let's move on.
OK, let's move on, Barry Garden. Let's move on. Shall we move on?
Well, look, I am just amazed after the reception that Suella Braverman got at the new Conservative conference the other week. I'm amazed that she's actually decided to keep Rishi Sunak in place. One could have imagined it would have been otherwise, but there we are. Anthony, to get to the nub of your question, there is an issue that I don't think has been aired or asked, and that is whether Suella Braverman had previously had a speed awareness course. Because you'll know, Anthony, that if you've had a speed awareness course, you're not allowed to have one within another 2 years. And if she was asking for a speed awareness course having previously had one, then it seems to me that would seriously contravene the ministerial code, because it would be trying to get particular favouritism for her in that situation. Now, I think we just need to be clear that did not happen, and in that sense,
there's no suggestion it did, though, as far as
well, there's no suggestion that she'd ever been caught speeding before yet. But then you wonder, why was she so keen to have the speed awareness course, rather than actually to just
pay the fine?
Pay the fine. And if it was simply that she asked, how does a speed awareness course work? Do I sit there on my own in front of a computer? Do I have to go and sit in a room with other people? If it was simply a request for information, then that seems to me perfectly legitimate and perfectly fine. But the fuss and the manoeuvring that's gone on about this just leads people, I think, to wonder if there's something more that was going on here?
Yeah, but that's because of the fact that it's always going to be a big political story afterwards. Because you ask about why would she do a speed awareness course? I did one about 8 years ago, something like that. Funny enough, I did one after I was elected, shortly after I was elected, and I had the guy next to me talking about his bins in Sutton when I was doing the speed awareness course. Why did I do it? Because actually, lots of people around the country, not only do you not get the points, I haven't got any points, so it wasn't ever going to affect me in terms of disqualification. It doesn't affect your insurance in the same way. So actually, you take your medicine, you learn your lesson.
But the implication was that she was asking her civil servants to do something that wouldn't have been appropriate, namely to sit down alone.
Well, wait a moment.
Rather than in the group.
Harriet,
this is something, I mean, this is not... First of all, she is the Home Secretary. So I think there is a problem with security here. I mean, she goes and does a speed awareness with a lot of other people.
They're done online.
That is a problem with security.
They're done online.
They're done online. I thought you had to go and do it with it.
I did. Well,
you can do it.
No, but she asked to do it one-on-one.
That's
That's
the
what she
problem.
asked. But this is something that celebrities do quite regularly. I mean, there's a solicitor called Nick Freeman. There's a solicitor called Nick Freeman who told the Times this regularly happens. He is always arranging one-on-one private things for his celebrity clients.
This is Mr. Loophole, isn't it?
Okay, she's not a celebrity, but she is the Home Secretary.
It's a cover-up.
So it wasn't.
It's trying to cover it up if you do that. It's trying to stop it ever getting out.
You just
incriminated there was no question of her trying. She was just saying, can I do this?
Yes, so that it didn't come out and so that we would never find out about it.
Well, why should it not come out?
But that's why she wanted to do it privately, to stop us ever finding out about it.
But
what evidence is there of that?
Why else would she want to do it
I haven't seen any evidence of that at all.
But Harriet, you've just
She took her points, and she did. But celebrities do it because they just don't want to be doing it. I mean, now you're telling me you do everything online, but do you do it with a lot of other people online?
Yes.
Do you do?
Yes, you do.
But
I've done one recently. About a year
speed awareness course.
A speed awareness course.
It's amazing how many people. I feel quite left out. I've never done one.
I'm obviously
I'm with you there. I've never done one either.
I have to say, everyone I know who's done them's really enjoyed them, but then they go to the place with a lot of other people.
And I'm fully aware of my speed.
Paul got ear-bashed about bins in Sutton.
But I think what's really important is Suella isn't a celebrity. She is a minister, and she needs to be held to account to the ministerial code. You were saying about oppositions looking for a problem, opposition parties looking for a problem. It is not opposition parties that set the ministerial code. It is the code that they should be working to, operating to, and upholding. And I think it's a sad day for the way that our democracy works when people are trying to avoid their role. I mean, if they just taken the speed awareness course, if people had been there, it would have been less of a story than what has happened now. And I think that this is. I think that there's a lot of points about the credibility of some of these points. I'd personally like to see Suella Braverman held to account for her terrible policies and her terrible way of working, which has been undermining some of the most vulnerable people in the world by persecuting those fleeing war on small boats to come to a safe place in the UK.
What do you mean her terrible way of working, Amelia? You can, just with her policies, what do you mean her terrible way of working?
We have evidence-based policies on how to ensure that we are supporting refugees and not just enabling them to potentially drown in the Channel. And that is safe routes. The current policies that the government have really benefit those people traffickers rather than benefiting those people harmed by war and conflict that we should be supporting people out of. And by targeting the very vulnerable in this scenario, it's really moving away from the fact that the government is failing on so many different aspects. I think that it really shows that first of all, that it's not evidence-based policy. It's not policy that's going to do the job that it says it's going to do. And I think it's really it is really demonising migrants, especially refugees, who are so harmed by government policy time and time again. And I think her lack of humanity is what should be held to account here.
Well, that's a very different
At least we're onto the substance. At least we're onto the substance. I disagree with you clearly, but we should be talking about policy. We should be talking about and held accountable for the decisions we are taking in Parliament. That's absolutely reasonable debate to have, rather than pick away.
Well, I like that. There's two women at the moment, two British Asian women who are both being targeted, and the other is Baroness Faulkner, who's being targeted by the trans lobby. And now, you may be really against what both these women represent, But that should not be, they shouldn't be kind of picked away and ground away at. They should be confronted if you don't agree with them. But the point is they are representing what a lot of people in this country believe.
But that doesn't mean if they are alleged to if they are alleged to have done something wrong, as Suella Braverman has been, it doesn't mean that we should just skate over that and sweep it under the carpet.
But is it... I mean, that, to me, it seems to be very debatable whether she's done anything wrong anyway. We can argue about that. But it just seems a bit petty.
Harriet, did she try and cover anything up?
Well, that's
No, I'm asking.
No, this is a good question. And I have to admit to you that I had not thought about this before. So you have made me think. And it never occurred to me that she was trying to cover anything up.
Paul, just on that. This has got a whiff of a cover-up, the fact that she was trying to do this course in private.
I can't second-guess what Suella did or didn't do. But what I'm saying is that the Prime Minister spoke to the independent advisor. He's gone to the Home Secretary, asked her... he took his time to come up with this. The opposition was saying, why don't you sack her now? Why don't you sack her now? Because the Prime Minister does what he does very well. He actually takes stock. He is a detailed person. He reads a lot about this. He would not have done something by impulse. And then he's taken his decision, having spoken to the independent advisor on standards. And that's really important to do. I wasn't part of that conversation, so I don't know how that conversation went, but I do know, as I say, that he wants to be seen to be doing the right thing. And what she's apologised for, and he pulled her up on, it's about the perception of impropriety as well as the actual possibility of impropriety. So we've got to be seen to be doing the right thing, and that's what's fallen short, I think, in this occasion.
OK, let's go. I want to go back to Anthony very briefly in Staines, Anthony. You asked if it was a sign of strength or weakness on the part of Rishi Sunak not sacking Suella Braverman. What's your view on it and what you've just heard?
Well, yes, I think your panel made some very interesting points, especially Barry, with that point that nobody had thought of before, so it's well done. But my opinion is, yes, weakness, because he's damned her with faint praise, but hasn't had the courage to get rid of her. So that says that in some respects he's betrayed that his feelings about her, but he hasn't acted on those feelings.
OK, thank you, Anthony, for your question. Going to Johnny and Vanessa next with a question about Boris Johnson. Lots more still to come. This is LBC. I'm Ben Kentish here with Cross Question. It's 8:18.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question. Tweet at LBC.
8:20 is the time, and in the studio with me for Cross Question tonight, Amelia Womack, former deputy leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, who's sped across London from an archery lesson, nonetheless, to be with us tonight. So thank you to Amelia.
After we hit all our targets,
you hit all your
targets. Council elections,
you've come to fire some arrows here.
See what you did there.
Barry Gardiner, Labour MP for Brent North and former Shadow International Trade Secretary, is here, as is Paul Scully, the Conservative Tech and Digital Economy Minister, and also candidate for the Conservative candidate for Mayor of London. And Harriet Sergeant is here with us too, journalist, author and research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies think tank. Next question for the panel comes from John in Inverness. It's a text question, and John says this: are the civil servants who redacted Boris Johnson's messages and are accused of a cover-up for doing so the same civil servants who reported him to the police and are now accused of a witch hunt? So this is about the Cabinet Office being accused by the chair of the COVID inquiry today of redacting too many details of Boris Johnson's messages and trying to cover up some elements of it in that sense, at the same time as being accused, civil servants, by allies of Boris Johnson, of a witch hunt for sending info about his ministerial diary to the police after suspecting that there might be evidence of legal breaches of lockdown rules. Barry Gardiner, is this the suggestion that these civil servants are responsible for a witch hunt of Boris Johnson? Anything in that?
Look, I have huge respect for the civil service. I understand that the lawyers from the Cabinet Office were actually acting on behalf of Boris Johnson. Now, the public may find it strange to know that they were paying for his lawyers. And I think that is something that many people will find very strange in the way that this whole issue, the legal bills were actually being paid, whilst he at the moment, I think, is out in Sin City in the United States giving a speech, probably almost now or a few hours' time, which will rake in to him personally more than an MP's salary in an entire year. Now, yet those lawyers who were acting on his behalf were under a legal obligation, as I understand it, to make available the diaries which contained what we understand to be evidence of further wrongdoing. Now, I don't know what that wrongdoing might be. That's a matter for the police to investigate and then the Crown prosecution to consider. I don't want to say either way, because that is a matter for them. It's not a matter for us. But any sort of insinuation that this is a civil service stitch-up, no, these are people of utmost integrity. They were people acting as his lawyers. He's now sacked them, I understand. But they were acting for him, but they had a legal obligation. We should respect that. We should respect the fact that our judicial system has that integrity, and we should now allow the police and the Crown Prosecution Service to get on with their job.
Harriet, it's not the first time in recent weeks we've had allegations from Conservative MPs, often unnamed, not always, that there's some sort of witch hunt by the Whitehall blob out to get certain ministers they don't like, particularly those that voted for Brexit. Is there any truth in it, in your view?
In my view, yes. I mean, I think that there's definitely you feel that the civil servants are a blob or a block against, because they disagree. So many of them, it's terrible to talk about them all as one big mass, but so many of them seem to disagree very much with what the government is trying to do. And it is creating a kind of febrile atmosphere in Westminster where nothing seems to be getting done. And actually, we all are picking away, rather like we did at Suella, picking away at Boris and did he do this and did the civil servants do that. To me, the far bigger point that we should be slamming Boris for is that with a huge majority that he got and with the big Brexit vote, that he completely failed to carry out the levelling up agenda for which he was voted. That is what we should be concentrating, not on whether civil servants have taken this or done that or whatever.
But you accuse them of not supporting what the government is doing, of trying to block it. What's the basis for saying that? How do we know what they think of what the government's doing?
Well, we don't know. We can only just go on anecdote, and we can go on
you
people
can't accuse the civil servants of being opposed to what the government's trying to do without some evidence.
I think there's been quite a lot of evidence for that. But I think the point is.
No, hold on. What? Right. Like what?
No, I'm not going to say any more about that. But I think that the point is that we should be actually going for Boris for that he's let us down, that he failed to do, or let people like me who voted Brexit down, that he failed to do what he was voted, and has done nothing, and has really caused, I think, enormous. A loss of faith in democracy by his actions.
Doesn't it also create a loss of faith in democracy when people accuse our impartial civil service of being politically motivated on the basis of no evidence? No?
Do you think it creates do you think that they're actually...
I have no idea what our civil service
All right, well, let's leave it at that then. Let's leave it at that.
OK, Paul, are the civil service a blob that is trying to object and block what you as a government are trying to do?
No, I think you have to almost separate the two things. So if you look at Boris's situation, clearly we haven't seen the information that's been passed on. It's right that we don't. Is the lawyers, as far as I understand, Number 10 and ministers didn't get involved in that. The lawyers are adhering to the Civil Service Code because it would come up out of the disclosure requirements for this, and then it came out, and then, as I say, because of the Civil Service Code, they were obliged to pass it on. It's now a matter for the police to investigate that. In terms of the civil service, I don't think there's a witch hunt. I'm not going to go down that line at all.
But some of your colleagues are.
I know. Well,
they're wrong. They're wrong to allege.
I think, in my view, there was clearly a process there, and that's been followed. But to cover your point about is there a blob, are they obstructing, and all these kind of things, I've worked closely with the civil service in 4 different departments now. I think in some areas there is often inertia. There is often a reason not to do something, and it might be because of you need this long consultation, or it's a bit tricky, I don't want to do that, put it into the too difficult to do box. You'll have special situations like Brexit and pandemic responses and these kind of things. But often it's the civil service, it's almost their job to actually push back and to say, you know what, for us as ministers, to really justify what we're doing. And I saw this firsthand when I was tackling the Horizon scandal, probably the biggest court mistrial in British history, where there, for over a decade, nearly 20 years, people were being prosecuted because of what they did. And actually there was a court case, and the civil servants at the time were saying, it's going to be a bit difficult to open it up again and provide the compensation and the surety for the people that have had their freedom taken away and these kind of things. Actually, once I started pushing back on that, many of the civil servants that I work with felt actually liberated, and they realised the injustice, and they worked with me really closely to actually get the results that we wanted. That's not finished.
Have you ever had a time where you felt obstruction from the civil service and you thought this is politically motivated?
No, I don't think I have. I think it was, there were some frustrations in COVID when actually people were going down one dogmatic way. And I'll give you a great example of that. And the 10 o'clock curfew. When I was Minister for London and Hospitality Minister, you could, the 10 p.m. curfew came in, and it was something that I could see I heard from the hospitality sector saying this is a struggle. And then I saw the mobility data from Google, which actually showed that the tube ridership went up 40% from 10 p.m. to 10:15, so we were shoving everybody down a metal tube. Not the best way of doing it. Actually, when we came up with that logical argument, the civil servants then came back and the Cabinet Office said, you know what, that's...
Come to me in just a moment.
Right.
But just on this, you disagree with your colleagues who say there's a blob, it's a witch hunt, it's a political stitch-up.
I think
what would your message to the Tory MPs making those claims anonymously often in the media, what would your message to them be? Do they need to just pipe down?
Look, I've got to be consistent logically with this. If we're saying about Suella Braverman and what we've got to, it's going to be investigated, draw a line under it. If you're saying about Boris Johnson and the Prime Minister and Partygate and all these sort of things, it needs to be investigated, then we need to draw a line under it. Similarly, you can't have everybody, or parts of my party, keep raking stuff up on the other side and talking about witch hunts and blobs and these kind of things. Not particularly helpful. It's not getting us anywhere. Actually, there's a cost of living crisis. There's a war in Ukraine. We've got our 5 measurable outcomes that the Prime Minister's talking about, the economy and NHS and the small boats. Let's focus on what's really important on people's day-to-day lives.
Amelia.
I think it's interesting that Boris Johnson is framing himself as the victim in this scenario. When we looked at the parties at Downing Street and the time that they were happening, when so many people were losing loved ones as a result of the COVID pandemic, that image of the Queen at the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral on her own was one of those moments that really made people take in point that point in time and the gravity of those actions. The way that Boris Johnson is framing himself as that victim is now removing from his actions. He's been found to have broken the law. He's been found to have been involved in those parties were at Downing Street. I was horrified by some of the reports. The one that really sticks in my mind is of the cleaners that had to go into work during that period and clear up the vomit of people who worked there. And I think that understanding how there's been this situation where a Prime Minister can believe that they are above the law at the time, and now that they are no longer Prime Minister, they are trying to make themselves above the law again. Seriously, this does need to be investigated.
Is that what he's doing? He's denying any wrongdoing. Is he trying to make himself above the law?
I don't think he's denying any wrongdoing. He's trying to stop an investigation. He is denying the wrongdoing as well. But I mean, I think it's the fact that he's trying to.
How's he doing that? I'm not sure he is. His police are investigating it. I mean,
He's just saying it's a witch hunt.
Well, he's not saying. I don't know.
Well, that's not that. That's a lot of
his allies are saying.
Sources say.
So with the because I believe he was getting lawyers involved.
Well, he sacked his lawyers, and now he's going to appoint new lawyers, which will also
be the point. That's sort of the point of investigation. You should be able to defend yourself.
You should have your lawyers.
Natural justice, isn't it?
But the way that he's making himself out to be the victim of it means that he is trying to avoid the investigation and trying to avoid the scenario.
No, he's defending an investigation, not avoiding it. He's defending an investigation.
But is he undermining it, Paul, by saying it's all politically motivated? Is that undermining the investigation?
Well, look, you could talk about sources say. I have no idea if this is something that's credited by. You can find anybody that will say.
And it came from his camp.
Isn't it just a shame, though, that tonight we spent the first half of this talking about two Tory MPs who have disgraced themselves in one way or another, or are purported to, instead of getting on and talking about the price of food and inflation and all the things that are really bothering.
We are going to do that very shortly, Barry.
A cart full of rotten apples. Basically, a whole cart full of rotten apples.
Patience. It's coming very soon. It's coming from Lawrence in Wembley in just a moment. 8:33 is the time, though. Let's get some news headlines first. From Daryl Jackson.
The singer Tina Turner has died at her home near Zurich in Switzerland. Her publicist says the 83-year-old had been battling a long illness. She sold more than 180 million albums around the world, was a two-time inductee into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and had 12 Grammys. The man, seen by many as Donald Trump's biggest challenger to become the Republican Party's US presidential candidate, has officially entered the race. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has filed his declaration. And the Cabinet Office insists it's fully committed to the COVID inquiry after a claim it's not handed over all the messages sent by Boris Johnson it should have. Downing Street promises all relevant material has been submitted. LBC weather, a dry night for most with clear spells. Thicker cloud will move south across northern England and lows of 4 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
8:36 the time. Ben Kentish here on LBC, joined in the studio for Cross Question tonight by Harriet Sergeant, journalist and author, Amelia Womack, former deputy leader of the Green Party, Barry Gardiner, the Labour MP for Brent North, and Paul Scully, the Conservative Tech and Digital Economy Minister and candidate for Mayor of London. We're going to move on in a moment to talk about inflation. Barry, I just want to ask you very briefly, while we're on the topic of MPs misbehaving, your colleague Neil Coyle has been allowed back into the Labour Party today, has had the Labour whip handed back to him despite allegations of harassment, of racist abuse of a journalist, sexual harassment allegations having been upheld. Is that a mistake for Keir Starmer on the topic of MPs doing things they shouldn't?
Look, I understand that Neil has said that he was suffering an addiction at the time. I understand that he has now accepted that and moved on. And I wish him well in getting his life back together again. If this can help, then great.
He racially abused a journalist.
He did.
And he's now back a year later in the Labour Party.
My understanding is that he did that whilst drunk. He's admitted to having a drink problem, and he is, as I understand it, in recovery. So, look, I don't in any way, not in any way, condone what he did. And you'll know it also made a personal reference to me at the time.
Yeah.
But I think, as I say, he's somebody who has owned up to having had a very troubled time in his life.
Doesn't send a great message, though, does it?
Well, it doesn't. I accept that. And it is difficult sometimes to make those judgment calls, and you have to. I think you have to look very carefully and say, has somebody really turned their life around? Have they really changed? Was this an aberration under the influence of alcoholism, or was it something that actually denoted who they were? I hope it didn't denote who Neil was. I hope he has managed to turn his life around. And as I say, I wish him well.
Barry, thank you. Let's move on to Lawrence's question. Lawrence is calling from Wembley. Lawrence, evening. Question.
Good evening, panel.
Hi.
The Bank of England has indicated that there might be 2 more interest rate hikes, apart from the one that they've just put up. My question is, should the governor, Andrew Bailey, be more accountable to how he manages the bank?
You think he should, Lawrence?
I think he should, because he's made mistakes.
Okay. Inflation is coming down. It's still eye-wateringly high. Should the Bank of England Governor, Andrew Bailey, be held more accountable for how he manages the bank? Lawrence, thank you. Amelia Womack.
I mean, accountability is going to be important at every point of where we work and operate. But I think that while we're looking at inflation at the moment, it's really important to be looking at the real impacts that it's having on communities at this time. And I mean, we're talking about people failing to be able to keep a roof over their head and food on their table. We're talking about real lives that have been harmed by a failure of policy yet again. We know that about 6% of our inflation has come from Brexit. We know that we have had impacts as a result of an energy crisis, and it's real people's lives that have been failed because of that. And I think we really need to be working to hold to account not just every person who has been part of those problems. I would personally hold to account the Conservative Party for a failure.
But it's the Bank of England that's tasked with keeping inflation at 2%, and it's exceeded 10%. That's a failure.
It's a failure of the Bank of England. The Bank of England, of course, should have more accountability. But
should Andrew Bailey still be in post?
At this point, we need to be, the rise in inflation is being caused by many other factors. And this is why I do want to be looking to the current government to be showing that there's also a failure of policy in how we are managing the UK at the moment that is harming people's lives. And it's not just the bank alone. Yes, they do manage inflation, but you need to go to the source of the problem. And I'd say that at the moment, the source of the problem is a failure of government policy and the way that we've been working and operating that has been harming many of the poorest communities across the country.
In what way?
In what way?
You just thrown about it's all like it's all government's fault. And they're like, what? Where did you get that 6%? I've no idea where that 6% came from. We heat our houses with gas more than other European countries. So we're more susceptible to gas prices. Clearly there's a war on the edge of Europe within that. We've acted, the IMF have said we've acted decisively on inflation. We've paid around half of the energy bills with the support and cost of living of the average household bills over the winter months. You've seen food inflation in Germany, France, places like Poland, and these like things, reaching up to 20% in some of those countries. You look at the changes we're making around the energy price guarantee. That's going to save around that in itself is going to save around 2% of.
So if it's not the government's fault, Paul, is it?
There's a mixture of figures here.
Over the decade that the Conservative Party's been in government, the minimum wage has failed to be a genuine living wage to support communities. Our communities are the very fabric of our communities have been cut apart by.
That's not the cause of inflation.
It's not the cause of inflation.
Let's come back to the question.
We gave you this biggest cash.
Let's come back.
Which, as you say, is not inflation.
Lawrence wanted to know if the Bank of England and the Governor, Andrew Bailey, need to be held responsible for failing control inflation. Paul, you're arguing it's not the government's fault. Is it the bank's fault?
It's a collective.
Can I just make a point?
Hold on. Let's Paul just respond to that.
It's a collection of factors that have fed into a worldwide increase in inflation. The interest rates that we've been talking about, the Bank of England, having been independent since '97, has one lever to pull. It has interest rates. That's all it has, and so that's the only way it can react. Actually, we've been living on cheap money for a long time now. I'd argue that actually that should have happened.
It's not the bank's
fault. That should have happened. They should have actually increased interest rates earlier to reflect what was happening in the States. So I do think they need to be open and transparent.
So it's partly their fault.
I think there's a lot of factors, as I say.
But partly the bank's.
Well, I think they could have probably responded earlier.
Okay.
That would have been my view, but.
Harriet,
I think
Amelia, I'll come back to you in a moment. Let's join to bring Harriet.
I think that the bank should have responded earlier, but on the other hand, it's quite refreshing for Bailey to actually come out today and say he's very sorry and we're living in unprecedented times, and he can't really judge what is going to happen. And I think that you've got to look at what's happening in Ukraine. This is an unprecedented situation. We have what it's food inflation that has really hit people. I mean, some items have just doubled in price. And what is the thing that all food needs is fertiliser. And fertiliser has gone up, I cannot remember, something enormous, like almost 10 times the price, because most fertiliser comes from Ukraine, along with grain. So that is not the Bank of England's fault, and that is not the government's fault. And that's hitting countries everywhere.
Barry Gardiner.
I love the phrase from Paul, it's a collection of things, when you asked him whether it was the bank or the... But
it is, isn't it? There are various causes of inflation.
But so it's partly the government's fault. Look, let's try and break it down. Amelia talked about the 6%. In fact, before the war in Ukraine, inflation was already running at 3 times the Bank of England target rate of 2%. It was running at 6%. So you can't simply blame the war in Ukraine for everything that's gone on. The war in Ukraine has had a huge impact. It's had an impact on transport costs because of the rise in the price of oil, and it's had an impact on food costs, partly for the fertiliser that Harriet just mentioned, but also because, of course, grain was not coming out of Ukraine and the cost of that. But look, we just heard today from the London School of Economics, their report, that actually £7 billion has been added to our food bills because of Brexit. That's because of the increased costs on business of having to do certification and checks. That's £7 billion into the economy. £250 each year for each household. The way in which we've seen mortgage rates rise, we're now looking at a situation where the bank base rate is predicted to go to 5.25. Okay, that means our mortgage rates are going to be well over 6, possibly even 7. that is an unsustainable leap for people, and it is causing people to be desperately worried, fearful.
So you blame Brexit for that more than you blame the Bank of England?
No. Look, there is a combination of things here.
But that's what Paul said.
Yes,
can I just bring up the 6%?
Before I finish, can I just say there's another issue, and that is profiteering. Profiteering that's been going on in the sector, and that even the chairman of Tesco has admitted he believes it's going on in the supermarket sector. If it were simply a case of, look, we're coming out of COVID, it's all been very difficult and prices have increased accordingly, you would expect that the profits of the supermarkets, if they were simply passing on the increased costs in their supply chain, would be roughly the same as they were before the pandemic. They're 97% higher. Now go to the food processors, the big food processing companies. Their profits are not 97% higher, they are 220%
What would you like
higher.
the government to do
There
about
is
it, Barry?
gouging
Let's put that to Paul briefly. What would you like the government to do?
I put it to Theresa Coffey about a month ago. She denied it. I then said to her...
What would you like the government to do about it?
You need to launch an inquiry into it. It's your responsibility.
Okay,
she refused. They now have launched a competition and markets authority inquiry into exactly that.
Paul,
but they've done it too late.
I want to put that to Paul. Emmanuel Macron in France has had the supermarkets in and tried to thrash out a way to get food prices down. Does more of that need to happen here, Paul?
Yeah, which we've been doing. I mean, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor...
It's not achieving much,
Well, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor... You know, you talked about Emmanuel Macron trying to thrash out a deal. The Prime Minister and Chancellor have been meeting the food providers for supermarkets and producers. There's been a CMA report on this as well, which we want to act on. And so absolutely, this is something. But you know, one of the things Barry was talking about when he talked about the fact that inflation was already running high, because food inflation was already going up, and it's not all. That's what I mean about the combination of factors. Why? Because we just shut the economy down for 2 years, frankly, and we've got a tight labour market as well.
Just in a word,
And China.
In a word, we're over time already. Do you accept Barry's claim that Brexit is part of the problem?
I think Brexit is something. It's 2 years of stasis. It's 2 years of stasis in Parliament. Frankly, we could have sorted this out a long time.
But leaving the EU has, as Barry said, has had an impact on prices.
Look, leaving the EU was always going to have an effect because
that's a yes.
But actually, what has been exacerbated is that the fact is having voted.
It's not about leaving the EU.
We're out
It's
of time.
about a bad deal when we do.
We're out of time. We're out of time. We've got to come back in just a moment. We're going to talk about Just Stop Oil and the panellists' views on that group and the police response to it. Ben Kentish here on LBC. It's 8:48.
LBC. Cross Question on LBC.
8:51 the time. With me in the studio for Cross Question, Paul Scully, the Conservative MP for Sutton and Government Minister, Barry Gardiner, Labour MP for Brent North, Harriet Sergeant, the journalist, author and research fellow, and the former deputy leader of the Green Party, Amelia Womack, is here too. Our next question is from Sharon in Dartford. Sharon texts, is it right that protesters are still being allowed to block roads by walking very slowly down them and stopping people getting to work? This is, it's revealed that the Metropolitan Police's response to the Just Stop Oil protest has used up 11,000 hours in just a month and cost the force £3.5 million. Barry, is it right that these protesters are still being allowed to do this?
Two things. I'm delighted that so many people in our society are desperately concerned about climate change, and I'm delighted that they're desperately concerned that this government is continuing to press ahead to extract every drop of oil from the North Sea when the International Energy Agency says that this is sheer folly. But no, we should not be blocking roads. There are laws against blocking roads, and actually, if by doing that you are putting other lives in danger, this is not the best way to protest. And I tell you why it's not the best way to protest. Because actually you're losing public support. I want protests that are, yes, protests will inconvenience people. They will. And we need to have legitimate protest in this country. And the fact that it will inconvenience people is fine, but not put lives in danger.
Would you like to see the police get tough with these protesters?
Look, this is not a matter about getting tough. This is a matter of enforcing the law fairly and squarely and making sure that I think we need to persuade people that the right way to go about this is to make your protest, to make it strongly and effectively, but most important of all, carry public opinion with you. This is such an important issue. They're right to be worried about it, but please, let's bring people with us, not alienate them.
Amelia, do you agree with that? Important issue, you'll agree with that, but is Barry right to say this isn't the way to go about voicing it?
I think there are a number of different principles at stake here, and that's to begin with the right to protest. We know that we have a proud history of protest in our country that achieved the right to vote, women's rights to vote, and protest needs to be a vital part of our democracy. But when we say, is it right that should police get tough, obviously the best way to stop any kind of climate protests would be to put climate policies in place that reduced our carbon emissions. And as the government is failing to do that, increasing numbers of people are getting frustrated, can't see their future. So many young people that feel like there isn't a future for them. I think that the tactics of many of the Just Stop Oil protests isn't about mass movements and engaging lots of people and bringing people along.
So it's unhelpful. You agree with Barry? It's unhelpful.
But I believe that that messaging of linking climate change to oil, making sure that there is a point where the government that we are talking about the climate policies that should have been put in place, to be honest, decades ago. We know about this issue.
But Sharon's question was about, should these protesters still be allowed to block roads by walking very slowly down them? Should the police let this continue?
So, as I said, the principle is we have the right to protest here. So it's part of our democracy. And I think that when we are, with many other protests, collaborating with the police about talking about where they'll be, there has been a lot of that information, communication and understanding about what's happening so that, the police...
Just to be clear, they should be allowed to continue, is what you're saying.
Part of the police's job is to facilitate peaceful protests.
So they should be allowed to continue.
I think that blocking roads in a dangerous way isn't helpful, but road blocking has always been part of protest. So I wouldn't want to come back to the principle that when we talk about protest, we need to be talking about the principle of the right to protest
Paul, I'll bring you in a moment. Let me just go to Harriet first. Harriet.
Well, I find myself in agreement with Barry here.
Harriet, you're in great danger of ruining both our reputations.
I know, I'm so sorry. But no, of course I am for. People have the right to protest, but I don't see that this blocking the road is actually winning hearts and minds. Yeah, totally. It's alienating people. It's causing havoc in people's minds, in their lives. And also, I don't understand the role of the police here. I mean, with the LBC said that the police have wasted hours and hours and hours policing this, but they haven't policed it. I mean, what have they done?
They've been there, but perhaps not arresting the protesters.
They've been bringing the protesters cups of tea. They've been asking them if they're okay. I mean, and they've been very quick to remove anybody who seems to be threatening the protesters in any way. They jump on them, but not the actual protesters.
So you would like them to just arrest the protesters?
I would like them to do... It is illegal to block the highway. They say they're not blocking it. They are as good as blocking the highway. It is illegal, they say, because they're moving so slowly, they're not blocking it. But it is illegal to drive slowly on the motorway. Why is it not illegal to walk very slowly down the middle of the road?
Paul Scully.
So I disagree with Barry's first part about the fact that about the use of fossil fuels. This is a transition to net zero. We're the first country to legislate for net zero by 2050, and it's how you get out that rather than just switch the lights off day one. But I totally agree with what Barry said at the end in terms of the fact that yes, peaceful protest, but they shouldn't be able to endanger people's lives. And so I've really ruined your career again, Barry, on that regard. But no, because that's the sensible approach, and it is a pragmatic approach. Just Stop Oil have been, when Amelia was talking about the fact that you collaborating with the police or talking to the police, they haven't done that. Lots, Extinction Rebellion even, and others have, but Just Stop Oil haven't. Exactly. So they haven't done that.
So why are the police allowing them to just crack on and get away with it?
I'm not sure they are. What I would contest is that you cannot take a handful of videos on social media and say that is exactly what's going to happen, because that's a moment in time. There were 8 arrests today, for example, of protesters. There's 45 over the last few days, and clearly there have, however, been examples on social media, those snippets in time. So you don't want to say it as necessarily a big trend, where you've seen people just getting frustrated, and they're the ones that are piled on by the police. We've got to look at it in the round, and I would just argue that yes, protest, yes, have peaceful protests, but for goodness sake, when you then get the opportunity, I saw one of the Just Stop Oil people have the opportunity on another television channel to have their say. They just started throwing political jibes instead of talking about what they are actually there to protect. Make the case, as you've all been saying, take people with you along the journey.
Just Stop Oil, and I think it's really important.
You can't do that overnight.
But your policies currently don't move
They're sitting there using oil-based products to actually share their messages.
Yeah, because the world that we live in is oil-based. We're forced into a system that means that...
Hence the transition.
The transition isn't moving quickly enough. And the reality is the IPCC have said that 2030 is our limit for 1.5 degrees.
Okay, we've got to leave it there, I'm afraid. Our last question, our fun question, and our strange question tonight comes from Gemma in Exeter. Well, depends on your answers, Paul. The sword, Gemma asked, the sword which Penny Mordaunt carried during the King's coronation has become the star attraction at a new exhibition at the Tower of London. Have the panellists been lucky enough to hold or even own anything which you think is museum worthy? Who wants to be put on the spot first? Barry Gardiner.
Penny Mordaunt was magnificent with that sword. We all know that. Yes, I have something that I would have loved to have put in a museum. It was my first car. It was a complete crock. It didn't work. It was a complete nightmare, and it should have been in a museum, not because it was a model of its type, but because actually it was far too ancient to be driving around the roads. So that's the only thing I think I've ever owned that I would consign to a museum, but not on its merits.
Where is it now? Long gone.
Long gone. When I got rid of it, it had to go to scrap. So that tells the story.
Barry and I's office contents are all in a museum. We work in a museum. I take people around. You always have to slow down to remind ourselves we're working in a fantastic museum. When I take Americans around, they always love the fact that Westminster Hall is nearly 1,000 years old. Yeah, and I then took the former mayor of Jerusalem around and told him that story, and he said, 1,000 years.
Yeah.
It's very different to different people, but it's the most amazing place. We're privileged.
Oh, you're dodging the question.
Absolutely.
Have you?
My entire office,
but I'm going to get you back to it. Have you been? Is that your answer?
Absolutely. Yes. That's the best I'm going to give.
Okay. Harriet.
Well, I adored my grandmother, and she loved jewellery, and she left me this ring, which I just thought, I mean, I have no idea whether it's museum worthy. I don't even know if it was worth a lot, but I thought it was fabulous. I thought it was definitely museum worthy. And of course, me being me, I lost it almost immediately. And I still, I mean, this is good decades ago. I still think about that ring and wish...
Never turned up.
Never turned up.
Shame.
I'm always waiting to find it somewhere.
Day. You never know. Amelia.
So, as a strong advocate for a proportional system, I hope that one day our first past the post ballot papers will be in a museum.
Boring. Oh, let me give you one.
I just clearly don't lead such exciting museum-worthy lives.
Let me give you one. My grandfather came from Burma in the 60s after my dad a decade before. I've still got his tea chest that he bought all his kit in.
Very nice. Good answer. Amelia, I think you get the wooden spoon.
Social distance.
I'll take it.
Right, we're way over time. Thank you so much for your questions, your calls during Cross Question. Thank you to our panellists, to Barry, to Harriet, to Amelia, and indeed to Paul. Coming up after the news, we're going to be talking about problem drinking, as a committee of MPs today sounds the alarm about the scale of this country's issue with alcohol. I want to hear from you if that applies to you. 10 million of us are drinking more alcohol than we should. 600,000 of us are classed as having a problem with alcohol. Is that you? And what does your story in that regard look like? But I also really want to talk about what help was out there for you. Because what these MPs are warning is the cuts that have been made to council budgets and health budgets mean that for far too many people, even when they do ask for help from their GP or from health services, it's simply not there. So if you have had or have currently a problem with problem drinking, are you getting the support that you think you want and need?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the singer Tina Turner has died at her home near Zurich in Switzerland. Her publicist says the 83-year-old's been battling a long illness.